15.4. The spinal cord and spinal nerves. Here's the diagram that breaks the nervous system into the central nervous system. Again, the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord, and then everything other than the brain and the spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. So we begin now looking at the central nervous system with the structure and function of the spinal cord. The spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest portion of the brain, down through the vertebral column, and it terminates around the first lumbar vertebra. Here's the diagram. We see the base of the brain, and then in yellow this represents the spinal cord extending down through that vertebral canal. The spinal cord proper ends there about L1, and then the remainder of the vertebral column is filled with some spinal nerves. We'll see the structures of these in just a moment. That lower portion is called the cauda equina, which means horse-tailed. The spinal cord conducts both sensory impulses. That would be incoming information. It comes into the cord. It's going to synapse on interneurons, and that message continues up the spinal cord then to the brain. The spinal cord also conducts motor impulses. So these would be initiated in the brain. So action potentials would be sent down the spinal cord and then synapse on motor neurons that will exit the spinal cord in the spinal nerves and carry motor commands to muscles and glands all throughout the body. This is, if we were to take just a cross section through the vertebral canal, you can see the body of the vertebra and then the opening of vertebral canal. Right inside that is the spinal cord, and then these spinal nerves, we'll look at the spinal nerves in more detail in a moment, branch off of the spinal cord. In this diagram, we've simply removed the vertebra so we can look at the cord more closely. Right in the center of the spinal cord, there is some gray matter called the gray H. Gray matter in the nervous system is composed primarily of neuron cell bodies and dendrites. The white matter is myelinated axons. Recall way back in segment 1 we looked at the structure of the axon, and those Schwann cells that are wrapped around the axon, collectively we call that the myelin sheath, and it gives it the glistening white appearance. So the white matter is myelinated axons extending then off of the spinal cord. We have some roots. These are called the dorsal and the ventral roots. Those merge to form the spinal nerves, and then the spinal nerves branch throughout the body to communicate with all the peripheral tissues. There are also some membranous coverings around the spinal cord. These are called the meninges. 3 different layers of meninges. These are also continuous all the way up the spinal cord and around the brain. So we'll see some more detail on the meninges when we look at the brain. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that directly branch from the spinal cord. The spinal nerve itself is called a mixed nerve because it does carry both sensory and motor information. However, the spinal nerve is formed by 2 different roots on each side. These are called the dorsal root and the ventral root. So those are the small little fibers that actually enter or exit the spinal cord. If you look over to the very far right of the diagram, there is a structure indicated called the dorsal root ganglion. That dorsal root ganglion contains cell bodies of sensory neurons. That's just an important thing to remember. Dorsal root ganglion is the cell bodies of sensory neurons, And so that dorsal root, those fibers that extend from the dorsal root ganglia and enter the spinal cord, those are axons of sensory neurons. So the dorsal root is sensory input only. The ventral root is the axons of motor neurons that are exiting the cord. So we do have segregation. The spinal cord carries both sensory and motor information, but it is segregated. We have these dorsal and ventral roots, and then those also form very distinct bundles of axons that are running either up or down the spinal cord.